I was halfway through an intake form for a 13-year-old who had been sleeping in a car with her mother when my phone went off in my vest pocket. It was a Thursday in early November. The community center smelled like old carpet and the lemon cleaning spray the evening staff used on the front windows. I was at my desk in the back office, the overhead light flickering in that way I had been meaning to report for 3 months, and there was a mug of Earl Grey gone cold beside my keyboard. The caller ID said, McIntyre and Associates Antigonish. I didn't recognize the number. I almost sent it to voicemail. Something made me answer. A man's voice, measured and precise, asked if he was speaking with Laurel Ann Hewitt. Nobody had called me by my full name since my grandmother used to say it, when she caught me sneaking biscuits before supper. I told him yes. He said he was a solicitor. He said there had been an accident on the Trans-Canada near Canso. He said my grandparents, Gran and Grandpa, Irene and Gordon Hewitt of Cape Breton Island, were gone. I remember staring at a child's drawing taped to the wall across from my desk. A lopsided house with a red door and stick figures holding hands outside it. I stared at it for a long time. I don't remember very much after that. Before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand what kind of family I came from. Not the surface version, which looked fine enough from a distance. You need to understand the whole thing. I grew up in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. My father was a commercial mortgage broker who had worked very hard to put a certain distance between himself and where he started. He drove a German car. He belonged to a golf club. He used the word optics a lot and meant it every time. My mother ran a lifestyle blog that in its best years had 40,000 followers, and she treated the house like a set. Everything styled, even the fruit bowl. I have a brother, 3 years older than me, who is my father's version of himself. Confident, well-networked, successful in a way that announces itself before he enters a room. By the time he was 25, he had a mortgage on a condo in Halifax's South End, and my father talked about it at dinner. The way other people talk about their children winning awards. I was quieter. I liked taking long walks in the fog and staying up late to read and volunteering at the food bank on weekends. I was, according to my mother's general energy, a bit of a puzzle. At the dinner table I mostly listened. The only place I ever truly felt like myself was at my grandparents' house, in Inverness County on Cape Breton Island. Gran and Grandpa had built Hewitt Marine and Logistics from nothing. My grandfather started with one second-hand lobster vessel and a supply contract to run materials between a few small coastal communities along the Sealage Trail. He slept on the boat some nights to save money. He had a grade 8 education and a handshake that people trusted. They had built the business slowly over 40 years, expanded into marine freight and equipment rental along the Atlantic coast. Done it carefully, done it honestly, and at some point without making any noise about it. It had become something substantial. Their house sat on a hill above the Brasdor Lake. You could see the water from the kitchen window. It was a small house, a little drafty, with a wood stove in the sitting room and a vegetable garden. My grandmother replanted every May. Rows of kale and beets and green onions that she put in herself, every spring, hands in the soil. My grandfather had a workshop off the back porch, where he would let me sit on an overturned crate and hand him tools, while he explained what each one was built to do. It smelled like sawdust and WD-40. It smelled like safety. My father was embarrassed by them. Not out loud, not directly. He was too careful for that. But in the small, persistent ways you notice when you are young and paying attention. He called their community the middle of nowhere, and made excuses not to make the drive. He referred to my grandfather's company as the boat thing, even after it had employees and a fleet and a proper office. He said it lightly, but the message was plain. These people were not what we were supposed to be now. What he never said was that they had floated him more than once. A down payment on his first property. A bailout when a deal fell apart badly in 2009. Another quiet transfer in 2017 when his firm was restructuring and he couldn't tell his partners. I only know those numbers because of what came later. At the time I just knew that Gran always smoothed things over, and my grandfather never once said, "I told you so" about anything, to anyone. I spent every summer there until I was 18. Gran taught me to bake bread from scratch, to put up preserves, to talk to people who were struggling without making them feel managed. My grandfather taught me that showing up on time and doing the work without complaint was its own kind of respect, and that the people nobody noticed were usually the ones keeping everything running. He called me Lori Girl. I still hear it when I am somewhere quiet. When I told my parents I wanted to study social work, my mother set down her fork and asked if I had really thought it through. My father said it was a hard field for the pay. They didn't offer to help with tuition. My grandparents did, without being asked, without conditions, and without once suggesting I might want to reconsider. Gran sent me a card the week I started at Dalhousie. She wrote in her round, careful printing, "We are so proud of you. The world needs more people who go toward the hard things. You are going to be exactly who you're meant to be. I kept that card in the inner pocket of my winter coat for years. I still have it. I became a child and youth worker at a community center in the north end of Halifax. My apartment was a one-bedroom on Gottingen Street that I loved despite the radiators that clanked all winter. I ate a lot of lentil soup. I took the bus. I had colleagues who cared about the work the way I did, and kids who needed someone in their corner, and that was enough. More than enough. My parents called occasionally. When they did, it was usually to mention something my brother had accomplished, or to point out that my cousin's wedding was coming up, and I should find something appropriate to wear. They never asked about the families I worked with. They never asked whether the funding cuts that year would affect my caseload. Every Sunday evening I called my grandparents. For 8 years, I never missed a Sunday unless one of us was sick. The funeral was held at the church in Inverness that my grandparents had attended for 43 years. It was full. Standing room. People had driven hours. Fishermen and logistics managers and a retired school principal, and the woman who ran the pharmacy and families who had known my grandparents since before my father was born. My father gave a eulogy that spent more time on the company's balance sheet than on the people who had built it. My brother stood in the receiving line accepting condolences with the practiced look of a man performing appropriate grief. My mother wore a brooch that was not hers. I stood near the back pew and cried until I couldn't, and nobody checked on me, and I didn't expect them to. 3 weeks later, we gathered at the offices of the solicitor on Main Street in Antigonish. The office was the kind of place where everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. Dark wood, morning light through tall windows, a photograph of Peggy's Cove on the wall. My father sat with his legs crossed and the posture of a man already composing his future. My mother's hands were folded in her lap. My brother kept glancing at his phone. The solicitor read through the standard language. I was watching a water stain on the ceiling in the shape of nothing in particular, trying to stay inside myself. Then he said, the entirety of the estate, including all shares and assets of Hewitt Marine and Logistics, the property at 7 Lakeview Road in Inverness County, and all registered and liquid accounts, currently valued at an estimated $17.8 million, is bequeathed in full to one person. The room went very still. Laurel Ann Hewitt is the sole beneficiary. My father said, I'm sorry, run that back. The solicitor did not run it back. He slid the document across the desk. My mother's composure went first. She said, this can't be right, and her voice had an edge I had not heard before. My brother looked at me the way you look at someone who has just taken something from you. Even though I was sitting completely still. They had anticipated a challenge to capacity, the solicitor said calmly. He opened his laptop. They had recorded a message. My grandparents were on the screen, sitting in their living room in the house on the hill, the water visible through the window behind them, gray-green and still. Gran had her good cardigan on. My grandfather had his hand over hers on the armrest. They looked older than the last time I had seen them in person. Their eyes were completely clear. My grandfather spoke first. He said, well, if you're watching this, we've gone ahead without you, and I'm sorry for that. We tried to leave things as tidy as we could. Your Gran picked out what I'm wearing, which is why I don't look like a fisherman for once. Gran smiled and squeezed his hand. We made this decision with our right minds and full hearts, she said, looking into the camera. We thought a long time about what we were leaving behind and who should carry it. Legacy isn't about money. It's about what you build in other people. My grandfather cleared his throat. To our son, and to you, he said, we love you. We always will. But we learned the difference between love and trust a long time ago, and we were watching. We saw how you spent what we gave you. We saw how you spoke about this family when you thought we couldn't hear. We saw what kind of people you were when nobody was watching, and when you thought nothing was at stake. Gran looked directly into the lens, and we saw Lori. She called every Sunday without being asked. She drove 4 hours to help put in the garden. She sat with us at the table, and she listened, and she never once looked at her watch. She is the keeper of this family's heart, and so, she will be the keeper of what we built. The screen went dark. What followed in that room I will not describe in full. My father used words I am not going to repeat. My mother wept in a way that had nothing to do with grief. My brother said nothing to me directly, but what he communicated with his silence was perfectly legible. They summoned me to my parents' house that evening. Some part of me went because some part of me still believed there was something salvageable between us. There wasn't. My father had a document prepared. He and my mother would serve as co-administrators of the estate. I would receive what he called a meaningful allocation. He had settled on 20%. He told me I was 29 years old with no business experience, and that this was about protecting me from decisions I was not equipped to make. My mother said, you're a community worker, Laurel. You live in a one-bedroom apartment on Gottingen Street. This isn't a criticism, it's just reality. I looked at the papers on their coffee table for a long time. I thought about my grandmother's voice on that screen. I said no. My brother put his fist through the wall beside the kitchen doorframe. My father told me that if I left that house without signing, I was cutting myself off from this family permanently. No holidays, no calls, done. I left. I found out within the week that the numbered company listed as owner on my lease, a numbered Nova Scotia Limited Company, was my father's. He had been my landlord for 4 years and I had never known. A formal notice arrived by registered mail. 60 days, as required under the Nova Scotia Residential Tenancies Act. Legal, calculated, designed to demonstrate that every piece of ground I stood on was his to move. I started packing the same night. My books. The letters my grandparents had sent over the years. Birthdays, small moments, just thinking of you cards in Gran's round, careful printing. The quilt Gran had made when I graduated, sewn from squares of my grandfather's old flannel work shirts and scraps of the sweaters she had worn through, and one square of the wool blanket she had wrapped me in, on the first night I ever slept at their house, when I was 4 years old, and the Cape Breton wind had come off the lake, and I did not know yet that that house would become the place I measured all other places against. I drove through the night. 4 hours along the 104, through New Glasgow and Ald's Cove and across the Canso Causeway, onto Cape Breton Island. The fog was in off the Bras door. The house was dark when I arrived. I sat in the driveway for a while before I could make myself go inside. The solicitor was on the porch the next morning with a tray from Tim Hortons and a paper bag from the bakery in Port Hood. He had tried my phone all night. When I didn't answer, he said, he figured I'd ended up where I belonged. He came inside and sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me what my grandparents had spent the last 3 years quietly building. A folder, then another. Gran had kept a ledger, not a formal one. A spiral-bound notebook she had started in 2008, with dates and amounts and notes in her small, careful hand. Every transfer to my father. The $40,000 in 2009. The $75,000 in 2013. The $180,000 co-signed loan in 2019 that had never been repaid, that my father had been servicing only the minimum on while telling his business partners. The books were clean. The books were clean. Gran had kept the statements. She had kept every piece of paper. Then the solicitor opened his laptop and turned it toward me. 2 days after the funeral, my parents had driven to Inverness with the spare key my brother knew about. The security camera above the workshop door. My grandfather had installed it 3 years before, quietly, after a conversation with the solicitor that I had not known about, caught everything. My mother went directly to the bookshelf in the hallway, moved aside a framed photograph of the lake, and opened the cedar box behind it. She took Gran's garnet brooch. The pearl drop earrings Gran had worn at their 50th anniversary. A gold ring that had belonged to Gran's own mother. My father stood at the window, with his back to the room. My grandparents had thought of everything. There were signed letters from their family physician and their pastor, each attesting to full mental competence. An affidavit from their neighbor of 31 years. The solicitor had filed a report with the ICMP the morning I arrived in Inverness. Before the week was out, my mother had returned the jewelry. All of it. Rather than face a theft charge. It came back in a plastic bag via registered mail with no note. The solicitor logged the return and filed it with the estate records. The $180,000 loan, with accrued interest, was formally called as a debt, owing to the estate. My father paid it in installments over 18 months. He had no legal ground to refuse. In the days that followed, they came. The people my grandparents had trusted. Dottie, Gran's best friend since nursing school, who brought 2 lasagnes and Gran's second journal, the one started in 2015. Ray, who had worked my grandfather's first vessel with him, and was now the longest-tenured captain in the fleet, who had heard my father on the phone one winter afternoon, saying that Gordon Hewitt was getting sentimental in his old age. About his own company, Felix, the company's accountant for 16 years, who laid the full financial records across the kitchen table, with a quiet precision that was its own form of fury, and Judge Margaret Dunmore, retired from the Nova Scotia Provincial Court, who had grown up 3 roads over from my grandparents' house, and who arrived in a good blazer and said simply, "Your grandfather did a favor for my family 30 years ago that I never had a proper way to repay." When my father, my mother, and my brother arrived the next morning, expecting to find me alone, expecting to find me small, they found that kitchen table full. My father tried his usual performance. He called it a circus. He pointed at the people around the table and said I had manipulated elderly people. He looked at the solicitor and said there would be legal action. The solicitor let him finish. Then he turned the laptop around. They watched themselves on the screen. My mother went perfectly still. Ray set the maintenance records on the table. The ones with my father's handwritten notes in the margins about cutting costs my grandfather had refused to allow. Felix opened the loan documents and placed them in front of my father without a word. The room went quiet in the way. Rooms go quiet when an argument has already been settled and everyone present knows it. I looked at my father. For the first time in my life, I saw him as he actually was. Not the authority I had spent almost 30 years trying to earn something from, but a man who had confused being given things with having deserved them. A man who had always been afraid that if he looked too closely at where he came from, he would have to look too closely at himself. "You didn't come here to protect me," I said. "You came because you were afraid of what I would do with something you couldn't control. You spent my whole life letting me know that I was the wrong kind of person in this family. But the two people who watched all of us the longest, who saw every version of us over 50 years, they chose me. I don't need you to agree with it, but I need you to stop pretending it didn't happen." My father had no answer. My mother was crying, and it may have been the first time I had seen something that was actually real move across her face. My brother left without speaking. The door closed. The room exhaled. The months that followed were full in a way I had not anticipated. The solicitor guided me through probate with patience and precision. Felix taught me the company's finances from the ground up. Not to run operations, which Ray and the team were more than capable of handling, but because my grandfather had always said that leadership without understanding is just authority, and authority without understanding is just noise. I learned what it cost a captain to be away from his family for 3 weeks on the water. I learned what the margins actually looked like, and why my grandfather had always kept the coffee maker going in the office and settled supplier accounts on time, even when the banks were slow. I found in the files something my grandparents had been quietly drafting for 2 years. The bones of a foundation, the Irene and Gordon Hewitt Community Trust. Their vision was specific and unpretentious. Bursaries for first-generation post-secondary students from rural communities in Inverness County and across Cape Breton Island. Supply funding for under-resourced classrooms in Nova Scotia schools. Grants for after-school youth programs in communities without a tax base large enough to sustain them. I put $7 million into it in the first year. In the first 18 months, 62 students received bursaries. I know each of their names. I kept working. I want to say that plainly. I kept showing up to the community center in Halifax every week, because the 13-year-old who had been sleeping in a car with her mother still needed someone in her corner. And that didn't change because of what was sitting in an account in Antigonish. What changed was what I could do when the situation called for it. When a child came in and the only pair of shoes he owned had split along the sole, I could do something about it. When a teenager showed a gift for music that her family had no way to fund, we could change that. The money was not mine to hold. It was mine to move. I live in my grandparents' house now. It still smells like the wood stove and the salt air coming off the brass door. Gran's vegetable garden comes back every spring because I plant it, the way she taught me, the kale and the beets, the rows of green onions, my hands in the same soil hers were in for 30 years. My grandfather's workshop is exactly as he left it. The tools are on their hooks in order of size. I have not moved a single one. On Sunday evenings the kitchen table is full. Dottie, Ray, Felix and his wife, the solicitor who has become something close to a second uncle, colleagues from my work in Halifax, neighbors from the hill, a rotating chaotic generous collection of people who loved the same two people I loved, and who chose to keep showing up for each other after they were gone. We eat too much. We talk too loud. We argue about the Caledonia Fiddle Society's spring schedule, and whether the new bakery in Mabu is better or worse than the old one. Nobody is performing anything. Nobody is keeping score. This is what my grandparents left me. Not $17 million. They left me proof that the work you do in people, the real, patient, invisible work of being present and trustworthy and showing up, compounds over decades in ways you cannot calculate. Every fair deal my grandfather made, every worker he treated with dignity, every favor done without keeping a tally, came back. Not to him. He never needed it to come back to him. It came back to me in a room full of people who had loved him and who were willing to stand up and say so when it cost something. Real wealth is not what you accumulate. It is what you build in other people. It is the kid from a small Cape Breton town who gets to go to university because someone she never met decided she was worth investing in. It is the classroom that doesn't run out of colored pencils in November. It is Sunday evenings where nobody has to earn their seat at the table. If you have ever felt like the wrong kind of person in your own family, if you know what it is to grow up in a house where love was conditional and approval was always just slightly out of reach, I want you to hear this. The people who truly see you are out there. Sometimes they are not who you expected. Sometimes they are the ones the rest of the world walked past without looking. And sometimes the people who were supposed to love you simply show you exactly who they are. And the most honest thing you can do is believe them. Don't spend your life auditioning for people who made up their minds about you a long time ago. Go be with the people who show up on Sundays. If this story stayed with you, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me about someone who saw you when others didn't. I read every single one.